My name is Alan Decker. I am 52 years old, and I want to share my racial and ethnic identity story with you over the next few minutes. This story is fairly unremarkable in one sense because it probably represents many white Americans who trace their origins back to Western European ancestors. However, in another sense, my story is unique because it's my story, and the next chapters are even being shaped and written as I speak to you today. My family heritage is Germanic and English. My last name is Decker. My father's ancestors emigrated from Germany, and their name derives its origin from the occupation of roofer or decker. My mother's family name is Lathrop. These people of the clay most likely originated from York, England. My family's working class roots have held pretty firm over the years and have produced a few notable characters. But most of us have toiled as craftsmen, farmers, public servants, teachers, and ministers. Although my ancestry is relatively humble, I now know that I'm the recipient of a very privileged life. I never considered myself or my family especially wealthy growing up, but we never lacked for the necessities or even many of the niceties of life. My experience may have been relatively normal by America's standards, but it is actually quite privileged when one considers the World Bank's estimate that nearly 2.6 billion persons live on less than $2 a day in countries ravaged by poverty, food insecurity, and government corruption. I now also realize that much of this privilege may have been due to the fact that I belong to the dominant racial and ethnic culture. Attending good schools, marrying well, getting good jobs, and accumulating a respectable number of assets may have had to do more with the cumulative effects of generational wealth transfer and being a white American than with my talents, intellect, or work ethic. This was made evident to me during a summer in Liberia, West Africa, when I was a junior in college. My 10 weeks of village work and Bible teaching in the local school were life-changing. For the first time, I was in the minority. However, I still represented white privilege and American affluence, and this was not lost on the Liberians. On my last day there, I said my goodbyes, and one close Liberian friend wished me well. He and I were about the same age, and I had benefited from his companionship and his support that summer. As I was leaving, he said to me, "Oh, and I would like a watch. Please send that to me when you get back home." Well, at first I was offended. No one I knew in America would be so brazen to ask outright for something like that, and hadn't our friendship been worth more to him than just a watch? But the more I considered this, I began to see that he didn't believe his request was out of line at all. He lived in poverty in Africa and would most likely die in poverty in Africa. I was going back to America, where to him anything was possible, attainable. And he was right. Even as a poor college student, I could afford to send him a watch. So I did. White privilege was also illustrated recently in a doctoral course on diversity and social justice. The professor lined us up in the middle of the classroom and then asked a series of questions designed to indicate our individual and collective levels of privilege. Those who could answer affirmatively to each question stepped forward, and those who could not stepped backward. By the end of the exercise, we were pretty well distributed around that empty classroom, and some of my racially diverse classmates were at the back wall. I was not, and I felt self-conscious. What I sheepishly realized in that moment was that in America, the land of the free and the brave, the playing field is not level. Some talented and hardworking Americans may begin the game behind the pack just because of their racial or ethnic status, and they may have to work and strive harder their entire lives just to catch up, let alone advance. I've lived and worked in the Midwest my entire life, an area where many European immigrants built homes, farmed the land, raised families, and then assimilated successfully into pioneer communities. Coworkers, friends, and church family look a lot like me. and most of us would consider ourselves to be hardworking, middle-class, God-fearing evangelicals who treat everyone with respect and courtesy. No one would ever assume they were a racist. But here's what I'm coming to realize. We think this way because we are blind to our extravagant privilege and blind to how our privilege allows us to write the rules and thereby oppress others who are different. What we white Americans experience as normal life is not the norm for many racially and ethnically diverse people. Author and professor Robert Jensen contends that even remaining ignorant of white privilege is a privilege. White people can ignore the reality of a white supremacist society when it makes them uncomfortable, can rationalize why it's really not so bad, and can deny one's own role in it. Yale Law professor and ordained minister Harlan Dalton writes about the dangers of failing to see white privilege. He has observed that people who trace their ethnic roots to Europe tend not to think of themselves in racial terms at all, and even think race is somewhat irrelevant. Americans in general are often deluded into thinking that we are individuals first, captains of our own ships, solely responsible for our own fates. Dalton identifies 3 adverse effects of white privilege blindness. First of all, whites don't realize that their lives are just as influenced by race as are the lives of people of color. Secondly, whites are often baffled when minorities, especially black individuals, interact with them on the basis of past dealings with other whites. They don't think that's fair. Finally, many whites fail to recognize that society has bestowed a highly valuable birthright on them just because of their skin color. This is the crux of racial injustice, the random and cruel rules of a game that dictate how some are allowed to leapfrog ahead and others must be in constant pursuit, trying to catch up and make up for lost time. One African young woman at my campus put it this way when discussing affirmative action's potential to undo some of the injustice caused by slavery. She said, slavery cut off our legs as black people. Affirmative action gave us prosthetic legs. That's helpful, and at least we can now walk pretty well. But as a race, we will never run fast. We will never catch up. So when I step back and reflect on how white privilege has impacted my own experience, I begin to see the relative ease with which I've been able to navigate through life on my own legs. I haven't encountered continuous barriers to getting ahead. I don't know that anyone has moved to the other side of the street to avoid crossing paths with me. My friends and I have never been stopped by a policeman after dark, asked for ID, and then all been subject to a search for a possible outstanding warrant. I don't recall a time when I entered a social setting and other people bristled at my presence or drew their children in closer to their side. I've never been asked to give the white perspective on a historical or social issue in a classroom. I've not been followed in a store, profiled as a potential shoplifter, or ignored because the clerk assumed I couldn't pay for the merchandise. It never occurred to me that getting an award or being denied an award may have had something to do with my race. But 3 young black friends at my college shared with me recently that they have experienced all these things and more. Attending a predominantly white school in a predominantly white community has been an interesting journey for these young men. They were all quick to say that for the most part, their college experience has been very positive. They've made great friends and they're thankful for the education they received. But for them, college has not been without racial tension and reminders that they are very much in the minority. For example, as young black men, they feel safer wearing their college logo sweatshirts and ball caps when venturing outside of campus because they know that people in the town will feel safer around them when they know these young men actually belong to the community. At the same time, these men know they must always play the game when entering predominantly white public spaces like restaurants or movie theaters. Don't be loud, call attention to yourself, get too close to a white person, or do anything that could arouse fear or suspicion. Lay low. try to be invisible. In spite of this, these young men are really remarkable. 2 graduated this spring, and 1 served this year as student chaplain at our campus. He will return next year to lead the Black Student Association, and he wants to focus the BSA's efforts on providing social and academic support so that more students of color can persist and graduate. On the whole, these students are positive and hopeful, but they're also aware that there's a lot of racial reconciliation work to do on our campus. One young man said he has noticed that many in our campus community hide behind the cross, resisting efforts to address issues of racial tension. Even some students of color want to avoid conversations around race because they believe we should all just be united in Christ. For my black friends, interracial dating is complicated. And in the classroom, the Anglo-conservative evangelical interpretation of history and politics gets a little tedious for them at times. These young men long for older mentors who understand their racial struggle, but they won't find many minority mentors on our faculty and staff. In fact, they will find no wiser black authority figures anywhere on our campus who are older than them. And this lack of diversity puts students of color at risk at my institution. According to Daryl Smith, professor of education and psychology, students, especially those new to higher education or those who don't see someone like themselves as faculty, can believe that they won't or shouldn't succeed. So what will be my role in writing the next chapters of my life now that this white privilege fog is starting to clear? Well, to start, I've agreed to be the faculty sponsor for Mosaic, the organization that supports intercultural initiatives and minority students on my campus. I will also attend as many BSA events as possible, and I hope to host at least one in my home. I'm taking a class in retention this term, and I hope to pass on what I learn to the BSA leadership. I think I'm ready to be slightly irritating on campus as well, exposing ways we are not taking our mission to diverse constituents. I will continue to ask questions about our minority students' college experience, and hopefully over time they may feel secure enough to tell me the truth. In short, I hope to become a bit of an advocate and use my voice in places where students of color may not have much of a voice. Why does this matter? Because students who persist and thrive in spite of being in the minority culture have much to teach those of us who are in the dominant culture. These students are resilient, they're perceptive, and they're wise beyond their years. They know a great deal about the power of community and interdependence. But this also matters because as a faith-based institution, we must model the kind of inclusion and equity that Jesus Christ preached and lived. Galatians 3:28 says that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. So accepting and building up all of God's children could be our highest calling. My heritage and upbringing reveal that I am about as white as they come, and I have benefited from a life full of white American, evangelical, educational, heterosexual, middle-income privilege. I know that deep within me exist racial attitudes and beliefs that will die hard. I will never fully understand the minority experience, and I shouldn't try to pretend I can, because I have not lived it, and for many years I have been blind to it by choice. But I'm not too white, and I'm not too old to grow and change. I believe I can learn to use my voice, be a friend and an ally to individuals I observe experiencing subtle or overt forms of racism. Nathan Rutstein, an anti-racism activist and a white man, believes that racism can be likened to a white mental disease that leads to discrimination against people of color. Rutstein claims that whites have a superiority complex that is covered up by denial and are afraid of exposing the deep prejudices that most of them know are wrong. He believes whites are also victims of racism because they have denied themselves the joy of acknowledging their own interrelatedness to all humankind. But the disease of racism is self-inflicted, and I believe can be best cured by waking up, seeing how others are being oppressed in this white privileged world, and then finding ways to address those injustices. Perhaps that's why my midlife racial awakening and recent conversations with students of color on my campus have been so enlightening and enlivening. Perhaps I'm healing and discovering ways to discover new dimensions of myself that could be developed through knowing their experiences better. I'm trusting that these discoveries may help me write the next best chapters of the story of my life.